Welcome to Crossroads. The Biden administration is rolling out yet more Trump cases, and this time a group of Trump electors from 2020 is again facing criminalization on an act that was widely viewed as a legal protection of the elections until recently. During the 2020 elections, you might remember, dueling electors in several states cast their electoral college votes for Donald Trump instead of Joe Biden. Now, this was because investigations were being carried out into possible fraud in those states. A lot of it was still ongoing. And the dueling electors would have allowed the vice president to choose which votes to count when the final decision was made based on, again, the ongoing investigations, although Pence says he didn't have that power. But look, despite the fact that Democrats have done this historically using dueling electors, the Biden administration, the justice system, they're alleging that this was a crime. Now, here's AZ Central, which lays out the claims and follows it up actually with profiles of all the known people who were indicted. This is AZ Central. It says 11 Republicans who signed documents falsely claiming, they say, that Donald Trump won the state in 2020 are facing criminal consequences in Arizona for the first time. It says a state grand jury on Wednesday issued an indictment in which the electors are each charged with 9 criminal counts, including conspiracy, fraudulent schemes and artifices, fraudulent schemes and practices, and 6 counts of forgery. Briefly, I should mention, you might notice here there's no charge of using dueling electors because it's actually not a crime. They're being charged with crimes based on the interpretation of the action. But the article continues stating the indictment names the 11 Republican electors and the names of 7 other defendants are redacted. We don't know all of them. It says those individuals have not yet been served, but details in the indictment make clear they include top aides, including, they claim, Rudy Giuliani and Mark Meadows. Now look, remember, the Democrats have already tried framing the idea of dueling electors as being part of a conspiracy to overthrow democracy. And again, dueling electors in and of itself is not technically illegal. You might notice that in these charges, they're not being charged with sending forward dueling electors. They're painting that as being part of a criminal conspiracy. And this is basically how it works. They say that Trump called for investigations into election fraud, that he appointed, Republicans appointed dueling electors. They conspired secretly in that process. They made legal challenges on the election to clear the way for that. And then they used the January 6th protest to try to force Mike Pence to count the dueling elector votes rather than, of course, the ones from the states or from the state leaders. And given that, they claim that this was a big conspiracy meant to overturn the results of the election. That's basically the basis of these charges. Now, that hinges on a few key points. Did Donald Trump know and believe that the elections were actually not rigged? Was that actually Trump's sincerely held belief? Based on the statements, I don't know if that's the case. Were the individuals involved in this actually convinced that the elections were not in fact rigged and they were just trying to overthrow the system? Again, I think that'd be hard to prove because many of them, at least on the surface, do seem to believe that they actually thought the elections were, of course, had issues, let's say. Although they are taking some behind-the-scenes comments and communications of individuals suggesting that they didn't fully buy the evidence. So take it for what you will, right? Now, this is happening while Trump is facing some charges around this. You might remember in Georgia, for example, with the RICO case, and possibly even more with special counsel Jack Smith, who's, of course, still investigating the Trump team and still rolling out different charges. But the big plot to get Trump removed from the ballots, that is basically off the table. And the attempt to make Trump ineligible to run for president again is also off the table, meaning they probably can't do that. Suggesting, of course, that the main possible agenda of making Trump never being able to be president again is off the table. It's not going to happen. And of course, you might remember the Supreme Court is also hearing the case right now of whether Trump can be charged at all based on presidential immunity. But we'll see where that goes. Now, the Arizona charges are important for the 2024 elections in other ways, though. Remember, while they cannot remove Trump from the ballot, this can actually affect other things. Namely, it paints the appointment of dueling electors as a crime. And it seems this is being set up as a kind of deterrent to stop dueling electors from trying to cast alternative electoral college votes again in the next election. This is AP News seemingly saying the quiet part out loud. AP News is saying these charges are part of a quote-unquote campaign. It says the indictment Wednesday is part of a campaign to deter a repeat of 2020 when Trump and his Republican allies falsely claim, they say, that he won swing states, filed dozens of lawsuits unsuccessfully challenging Democrat Joe Biden's victory, and tried to get Congress to let Trump stay in power. Again, they're laying out the conspiracy allegation here. But what's interesting is they say this is part of a campaign, that the attempt to, again, incriminate the very act of getting dueling electors is part of a campaign. This is where people are kind of pointing to. Now, regardless, though, they're also framing the Trump allegations that this is part of a big conspiracy also as a campaign. And they say that campaign culminated with the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol. They say the penalties piling up for that push include lawyers who helped Trump being censored, sanctioned, and recommended for disbarment. Added to that are multi-million-dollar libel penalties and now criminal charges in 4 states for spreading lies about the 2020 election, they claim. It notes that effort included submitting fake electors contending that Trump had actually won the states and that Congress should recognize them rather than electors won by Biden. Again, dueling electors. The corporate media, they're mostly framing them as fake electors now. They're not using the historic name for it. Now, David Becker, founder of the Center for Election Innovation and Research, said that people are going to have to think twice about doing things to undermine the election. And he continued, noting the deterrent effect is real, of course, of them incriminating this act. Now, look, just to make things clear, the system of what I'd frame as lawfare, right, legal warfare, has made it risky for anybody to question the integrity of elections. What kind of a state are we living in currently? Well, currently, if you question the integrity of the elections, if you protest the outcome of the elections, if you call for investigations into alleged fraud or use historic legal avenues to challenge the fraud, including investigations, including dueling electors, as we're seeing here, then you risk being criminally charged. You risk being tried with racketeering cases of criminal conspiracy. You risk being sued for literally $1 billion on some cases. You risk being thrown in solitary confinement while facing novel interpretations of crimes that most people have never heard of, like disrupting an official proceeding, an Enron charge, a financial charge applied to protesting Congress. And the list of these things go on. And so, if fraud does take place, what happens? Well, look, any action that has historically been used to challenge evidence of fraud or people thinking things weren't done well, as AP notes, it seems that this is part of a campaign, as they say, to deter a repeat of 2020. It seems they don't want people challenging the election results this time around no matter what. But look, the framing from AP as these charges being part of a campaign on this is raising some concerns of its own. But I'll be talking about this more after a quick word from our sponsor.
Experts agree. One of the best ways to protect against financial uncertainty is to diversify your portfolio. Learn how physical gold and silver can secure your retirement funds from today's economic challenges with a gold IRA from American Hartford Gold. You can safeguard your wealth with no penalties or taxes when you transfer your current qualifying retirement accounts. Call now and our precious metals specialists will send you a free information kit, no cost or obligation. American Hartford Gold, a trusted industry leader with an A+ from the Better Business Bureau, has a 5-star rating from thousands of happy clients. Whether you are getting physical precious metals in a gold IRA or delivered to your doorstep, we offer only the highest quality gold and silver. For your peace of mind, we also offer a no-fee buyback commitment, a low-price guarantee, along with free shipping and free insurance. So don't wait. Call the number on your screen today and secure your financial future.
Welcome back. Now look, 11 Republicans who signed documents stating that all this stuff happened, that Donald Trump won the state in 2020 in Arizona, They have now been indicted, and of course some are not yet named. The Associated Press has framed these charges as being part of a campaign to deter a raising, of concerns of its own, right? It say that conservative news outlets have been quick to point this out, and there are concerns that the charges themselves appear to be a form of election interference. This is one of the concerns, of course, being raised on the conservative side. The Federalist states that under the headline, charges against Trump's 2020 fake electors are expected to deter a repeat this year, AP, as we just showed you by Nicholas Riccardi, wrote the indictment of 18 people total could help shape the landscape of challenges to the 2024 election, the next one coming up. It says the outlet cited Center for Election Innovation and Research founder David Becker, whose organization, they say, helped dump hundreds of millions of dollars in Zuckbucks, that was the Facebook money, into local election offices to influence election administration to emphasize the deterrent effect. Briefly on the Zuckbucks, you might remember that Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook and so on, was accused, of course, of having his election integrity operations unfairly benefiting Democrats while unfairly undermining Republicans, and people say that might be a violation of the nonprofit status of the organization. It's never been charged. We don't actually know, right? But look, back to this article. It says it's not just the AP drawing the connection of this big campaign, as they frame it. They say a well-known election integrity advocate told the Federalist that she was contacted by a New York Times reporter on Thursday and was asked whether the Arizona indictment and other state elector cases impact your strategy/approach to the 2024 election, suggesting again that these charges are meant to send a message. They're meant to send a message that you cannot challenge the outcome of an election using most of the historic means of doing so. Now back to this, it says the conspiracy that Mays has accused 18 Republicans, however, involves the same kind of electoral disobedience that Democrats engaged in without consequence in the past. In fact, in many elections, they did many of these same things. Remember the real story of dueling electors, or the other side of it, right? Again, you might remember what was the state of the dueling electors in 2020. Well, look, there were ongoing investigations of election fraud. The nation was not yet sure which way those investigations would go. The Supreme Court, of course, famously or infamously rejected those cases, but they did so without actually looking at the charges. Most of the cases were dropped by courts without ever being tried. The evidence was never put on trial, and in the few cases that it was, well, oftentimes they did find evidence of fraud. In other words, though, we never really knew whether some of the allegations were true or false, because again, they were never put on trial. Now, under the American justice system, lawsuits and investigations are the normal legal avenues for dealing with allegations like what the nation was facing. And keep in mind, there were in fact legitimate concerns of fraud, given the fact that we were living in unprecedented times with COVID lockdowns and also under major changes that were being made to election laws because of that. We saw things done that were never done before. Many safeguards on our elections were removed, and notably, a lot of them are still removed. And this led to things like, you might remember, universal mail-in ballots seemingly here to stay, and other things that used to be illegal because they could lead to fraud. And of course, people suspecting fraud might have taken place was not that far-fetched. Now, what happened? Based on those concerns, based on evidence presented, based on even, of course, witnesses and so on stepping forward who would legally count as evidence in criminal charges, these individuals are coming forward making these claims, and what is the normal reaction of that? Well, you need to investigate. Not investigating such allegations could be a crime in and of itself. And so investigations were launched, and based on those ongoing investigations, people were not sure which way this was going to go. But now we're seeing those legal avenues that have historically been in place for handling claims of fraud are now being instead framed as crimes in and of themselves. In fact, even some of the lawyers are facing charges for even pursuing the cases. They're facing disbarment even in some areas. and states that were unsure of what the results of the investigations would be. Well, what did they do? They put together dueling electors so that when the Electoral College votes were counted in the end, based on what kind of evidence had come forward, again, Congress or the vice president at the time could then make the decision to decide which of the votes to count. Now, you might remember as well when former Vice President Mike Pence read the votes, the Electoral College votes on January 6th during the large-scale protests, he did not read the dueling votes. He claimed he did not have the authority to do that. And then you might remember what else happened. Well, Congress rapidly changed the laws to make it so that it would be illegal for a vice president to do what Pence claimed that he couldn't do, which for many people raised the question of, well, if he couldn't do it, then why did they have to make it illegal to do it if he couldn't do it, right? If it was already illegal, then why did they have to change the laws to make it illegal? Look, to be fair, technically they clarified through law that because it was not technically clear, meaning it was up to interpretation, of course. But of course, he was interpreting it one way, other people interpreted it another way, and lawyers and so on, legal counsel, were suggesting that he could have had the other option. It's debatable, but Congress has now changed it, so it's written in stone now. Now, this being said, though, there are unprecedented charges coming on this. But with all this, again, coming up next, what does the country do in 2024 if there's evidence of election fraud? If, for example, there are serious concerns, if it seems that there were problems with the election this time around, if all the normal legal avenues are now deemed illegal, what avenues are there for people to protest or question what took place? Well, look, that's an issue that many conservatives are raising in particular, and they're even pointed to cases in the past showing on record that dueling electors were deemed a legal means to use in an election. This is Charlie Kirk, the Charlie Kirk Show, also Turning Point on. He said this. He said, what are the charges for? For trying to follow the law and following a precedent created by Democrats. He notes that in 1960, in the race between Kennedy and Nixon, Hawaii was very closely contested. He notes that while Hawaii certified Richard Nixon as the winner of the state's electoral votes, Democrats claimed otherwise. They assembled their own state electors and submitted their own votes to D.C. to be counted while the state worked out the contest in the courts. In other words, again, within Hawaii, it was not sure which way it was going to go. They appointed dueling electors based on that, very similar to happen, of course, recently. Now, Charlie Kirk notes that importantly, this worked at the time. After initially certifying Nixon's electors, Hawaii's recount concluded that Kennedy had won the state by just 150 votes. The state's governor retracted the Nixon certification and submitted a new one in favor of Kennedy, right? It says that Kennedy votes were only counted because the Kennedy electors acted before the courts have ruled. He said, here's a quote from Politico when they wrote about this dispute. Quote, Judge Ronald Jameson agreed that the certified Kennedy electors were legitimate. But more significantly, Jameson said it was important that those electors met and gathered on December 19, 1960, as prescribed by the Electoral Count Act. Rather than suggest the Democratic electors committed fraud, the judge, he says, pointed to the meeting as a key step that preserved the ability that they be counted after the recount, and it showed that Kennedy had actually won the state. He continues stating, the Arizona Trump electors were doing what they thought, he claims, was a legally necessary step as part of a wider political and electoral dispute. He says these indictments and this entire investigation are a sinister effort to criminalize pursuing all legal and constitutional avenues for contesting a disputed election. He says that A.G. May's international Democrat handlers want to criminalize and punish political dissent. Now look, of course, people are noting differences between the dueling electors in the 1960 case and the dueling electors in 2020, and this is basically what they say. They note that in 1960, there were ongoing recounts. In Hawaii, again, the race was very close, and there were ongoing counts, right? They claim there was an air of secrecy around the dueling electors in the 2020 case, suggesting, of course, that the 2020 case was not based on, hey, it was a close race and we don't know who won, and instead they're claiming that the 2020 case was a conspiracy, that people gathered together and conspired, to basically try to rig the election, which I don't think is really true personally, given they published an open statement saying what they were going to do, meaning it wasn't that secret if they published, again, an open statement in 2020. But there's also the allegation being touted that most of the corporate media on this, right? They say the corporate media is saying there was not any fraud in the 2020 election, at least none that could have changed the outcome of the election. And so based on that, they claim the entire narrative of dueling electors being part of a plot. They're saying it's, again, basically a conspiracy to overturn the elections. A lot of this is based on the interpretation of the intent of the forming of the dueling electors, basically, right? The foundation of this entire narrative is that the dueling electors were appointed on the belief that the election was in fact fair, that Biden had won, and they wanted to intentionally change the results. That is the foundation of the allegation. And of course, to make that charge, you have to prove that people didn't actually believe what they were doing, that they believed that, Biden won and they were going to vote otherwise. But I would point out, based on the Hawaii case and based on the Arizona case, I do think that there were reasons of potential different outcomes of the election. Again, there were investigations going on. Just like there were recounts taking place in Hawaii, there were, of course, ongoing investigations in Arizona and other U.S. states. And based on that, they appointed dueling electors who, based on the model, again, of the Hawaii case in 1960, could have gone down the same route, that once the investigations had finished, if they did find that fraud had taken place and would change the outcome, then just like in the Hawaii case, they could go back and use the dueling electors to alter the outcome of the elections. That was the basis of it. But again, look, the comparisons have to do with arguments over details. Obviously, there were different elections with different concerns. In my personal opinion, the issue on the specifics of what led to the appointment of dueling electors, it's not really the focus, right? I would say the real focus is on whether the appointment of dueling electors is legal or not. Because, if we want to argue what is the internal thinking of the people who appointed the electors and of the electors themselves, we don't know what they were thinking. But of course, that's the basis of the charges. That does not mean that dueling electors are illegal or legal, right? And so without a doubt, we know that historically this has been done, and so we do know there's legal precedents on dueling electors in and of themselves. We're having two separate debates, in other words. On one side, there's the debate over the legality or illegality of dueling electors. On the other side, there's the debate on whether the people who appointed dueling electors actually believed that maybe the elections were rigged, right? But remember, not only have dueling electors been legal in the past, as we just showed you the 1960 case, but there are even more extreme examples, things like, for example, faithless electors. And Democrats actually pushed a major campaign in 2016 to try to get the Electoral College members to change their votes to become what are known as faithless electors. That would go even further than appointing dueling electors and to just call alternative votes on their own, basically. I'll be talking about this more, though, only on epictv.com. So for those of you on YouTube, Facebook, X, Rumble, this is your chance to join us for uncensored discussions on the topics that matter and that the corporate media typically don't really cover. Now, we've been at the forefront of many stories, including the lockdowns and the pandemic, China's long-held plans to subvert the United States, and what really happened on January 6th of 2021. In fact, we have many special reports and documentaries on these topics, some of which I've done, as you know. So click on the link in the description and come join us on epictv.com if you want news you can trust. Now, before we jump, let me show you a trailer of part 2 of January 6th, the documentary we did on it.
Calling the January 6th investigation the biggest investigation in FBI history.
There are more than 1,100 arrests, and they show no signs of slowing down.
When you take an oath, you have to abide by it.
They're just going to identify you on video arrest you and then figure out what the evidence is after that.
Those involved must be held accountable.
He's an innocent man, and he has been punished for something that he never did. Every day you wake up and you're like, how did I get out of bed today?
You have to stay away from the word patriot now because that's a terrorist organization.
We interviewed 2 whistleblowers from the FBI.
I sacrificed my dream job to share this information with the American people.
That siege was criminal behavior, plain and simple, and it's behavior that we, the FBI, view as domestic terrorism.
We started with death threats, the hate mail.
I don't care what they do to me, but I do care what they do to my family.
Our family struggles every day.
It's going to change narratives no matter what your political perspective is.